Hey everyone, this has been, the month of May is coming to a close, which has been Mental Health Awareness Month. I've been disputing myself all month whether if I should make this video. Then I got a little sidetracked with all the issues I had with YouTube since April that have in a technical sense been resolved as of the 14th of this month, but still I've been debating myself on whether to make this video. It's basically my personal testimony to why this particular issue is so important to me. If you haven't first done so, please watch my Fade to Black video, which is my physical expression of my personal stance on mental health awareness, or the lack of mental health awareness it actually gets, the lack of legitimate consideration it actually gets from the general public, and the lack of competence it gets, and how serious it's actually taken by the general public. People hear the words mental health and think it's some sort of layman's term for being sad or lazy. Some sort of lazy term to just make everybody feel like they have some sort of affliction, whether it's physical or not, and they have to be treated for it just to feel as part of some sort of big pharmaceutical conspiracy theory or something. I can assure you all that is not the case when it comes to mental health conditions. Mental health covers a variety of things, from depression to anxiety, drug addiction, schizophrenia. All those are just a few mainstream traits of mental health. I myself suffer from depression. I guess you could say anxiety, social anxiety, I should say. I'm going to try my best, by the way, to not do any cuts here, because I'm trying my best to be as legitimate in this video as possible. So if there's any long pauses between things I say, just bear with me. I'm doing this unprepared. I'm just doing this on the whim. I just got out of the shower and just felt that I should make this video now since it's the 27th. As I stated, my particular case in regards to mental health is depression and anxiety. Things I still struggle with to this day, things I've struggled with since I was a child. Now, I can't say this with any sort of confidence in how accurate it is, but my earliest memory of what could have triggered my mental conditions can be traced most likely back to when I was a child, back when I was 6 or 7 years old. Back in those particular days, the vast majority of the reason in my particular area of the Midwest of the United States, the vast majority of the reason other students either saw you as an easy target for bullying and whatnot was because your parents were no longer together. And I do believe that was part of the case in my particular scenario. My parents had divorced when I was around 5 years old. I remember the night it happened. I won't go into that, but to make a long story short though, I had no friends in school for the most part. And I think most of it stemmed from the fact that because I was the only student who didn't have parents who were divorced at the time, they saw that as a reason to think I was different enough to be seen as an outcast. The fact that I didn't have friendships made me easily susceptible to them when they were offered from anyone. This was a period where my mother would take us to visit my cousin a lot. And sometimes they would visit us. My cousin sexually abused me when I was around 7 or 8 years old. And it was easy because he offered me friendship first. Friendship I wasn't getting from a social standpoint in school, in the general public, anywhere. I wasn't getting it anywhere. Since I was seeing him on a frequent basis, and he spent time with me, it was easy for me to be susceptible to manipulation. And he sexually abused me using that manipulation in my room. Back then I shared the same bedroom with my mother in the apartment complex we lived in at the time. We would just... I had a closet that was pretty spacious for what it was. You know, I was able to use it as a little bit of a hub for myself when I needed privacy. And he would basically sneak me into that closet, and then he would drop his pants and he would ask me to do sexual things to him with my mouth or with my hand. And I was around 7 or 8, and I did it because I viewed him as a friend and I thought I was doing him a favor. I didn't know what he was asking me to do was wrong because I was 7 or 8 at the time. You know, when people get on, especially MJ fans, when people make allegations of sexual assault against someone and they just outright come out in opposition to them, I take that personally. And I always will take it personally because I can speak from experience that with my lack of sexual education when I was 7 or 8, especially in the household I was raised in, where sexual education was seen as a health hazard, I can assure you from personal experience, oppressing someone making serious allegations such as that is the wrong thing to do, especially if you're going to give them, why didn't you come forward when it happened? Well, I didn't because I was 7 at the time. I didn't know what was happening to me. I didn't know what I was being told what to do. I did not realize what had happened until I was maybe 13 or 14. And that was only after I had suffered, and I do mean the word suffered in the most literal sense, suffered through puberty. I say suffered because the lack of sexual education and the efforts that went into that education being withheld from me caused a great deal of trauma on me in my adolescence and in my years of puberty, of my sexual evolution. Because of it, it took me almost 20 years after the fact to start seeing the opposite sex, for example, as equals, and as opposed to in being inferior, as society likes to portray women as being. If I wasn't raised with a half sister, an older half sister who was feminist, who was also just as much as a pro sex positive person and sexual discretion, I don't know how I would be today from a sexual standpoint in regards to how I not only see the opposite sex, but also how I basically see anyone. My cousin sexually abused me. I was denied sexual education, therefore it took me years to learn what autonomy was. It took me years to realize what rape is. It took me years to learn anything in regards to sexual factuality. When I had learned what it was, I was still growing. I still needed a lot of room to grow, because when I actually learned it, I still tried to cater to my cousin. I still tried to make it seem like he wasn't in the wrong, because I've had these feelings myself when I was in puberty. I said to myself, I don't blame him for not being in control of his libido. I went through it myself when I went through puberty. I gave him the benefit of the doubt still. I don't think I started really developing the proper hatred for him and the things he did to me until I was maybe in my late 20s, if not early 30s. I'm approaching 35 in a couple months. So I haven't been in this particular mindset for very long. That what he did was vile, disgusting, nasty, and that it was rape. Now, when I see other victims being given the treatment of why weren't they upfront with what happened to them when it happened to them, especially if they were only as young as I was, sometimes even younger, I take that personally, because I know, I've been there, I know how it goes. So, this particular instance, multiple instances, because he did it to me more than once, several times, it stagnated my development. It traumatized me from a sexual standpoint. It really influenced my perspective of the general population from a sexual standpoint. I suffered in again, in the most literal sense, when I went through puberty. Because if anything ever happened to me sexually, rather if I woke up with an erection, which, by the way, everyone tends to do once they go past puberty, so that's a normal thing. But when I was a teenager going through puberty, if I ever woke up with an erection, I would get chastised for it. I would be yelled at for it. I would be shamed over it. I wouldn't be educated on it. All of my education from sex came from pornography, literally. That's where all my sexual education came from. Pornography that I either stole from my cousin who had a stash under his bed, or that I found on the internet, or that I sometimes just randomly got in the mail, because there was a period of time back then when pornography catalogs were adamant. They were adamant in the Postal Service. They were sent to random houses, and we got them all the time, and that became part of my stash, and that became part of my education. Part of the reason why I probably developed a demeaning perspective of the opposite sex. The lack of education just gave me a stupefied perspective of society as a whole. It really influenced my relationship with other kids in school. It totally destroyed my way of having conversations. I mean, I get anxious just being around people from 20 feet away, much less being right next to them. I can't even talk on a telephone without getting super anxious about it, because it's just the thought of talking to someone without actually looking at them just irritates me. It took me years after the fact I realized what had happened to me, and after I got over the insane apologetic trait of acting like I sympathized with my cousin for what he did to me, that I came to the decision to basically exile him from my life. And I have not, to my knowledge anyways, I have not identified him to everyone in my family, but the people I either have been with the most in my life, such as my mother and my half-sister especially, you know, my most immediate siblings, they know. And only one of them has, outside of myself, has acted accordingly, the way you should when you hear something like that happening to someone you love, someone you care about. And I think the lack of this education and the way I was oppressed inside the household for my body's development, and sexual evolution, really influenced my depression. For years and years and years, I had seen therapists who half the time tried to make everything my fault, who half the time tried to make my parents the good guys and me the bad guy, and the other half of the time drugged me. There was a point in my life where within the span of a year, I was on 4 different antidepressants simultaneously. There came a point in my life where I eventually became suicidal. This was back in 2002 to 2003 was my year of suicidal tendencies, to the point where I was actually trying to take my own life. And that was because I realized I had insane access to an even more insane amount of antidepressants. The 4 antidepressants I was taking in 1 year, that was just that year. I've had others from years before. I had easy access to these medications, and so I used it to my advantage. I started overdosing on them. I've done this several times between the year 2002 and 2003. Overdosing on my own antidepressant medication. There actually came a point where the combination of the pills I was taking, I'm only assuming this actually, this has never actually been proven, but this is, I mean, what else can I go on? I never took drugs outside of antidepressants. I overdosed on my antidepressants to the point where I lost consciousness in school one day, and I woke up in the hospital, and apparently they tested my system, and apparently they found speed in my body. And literally, the only drugs I've ever taken in my life have been my antidepressants. So my assertion here is that the combination of all these pills made speed, but that which is asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence, is a saying I like to use. So that claim can be dismissed. But that's what I'm going with. So my stance on this is that all these therapists I was seeing that were drugging me dealt me speed in the form of multiple prescription drugs, prescription antidepressants. But so now I got parents that think I'm a drug addict because of the speed part. Not because I was on like 6 or 7 different antidepressants within the span of 2 years. No, that's crazy, right? Well, this was also the point where I started to become very critical of religion, of Christianity especially. Because most of the problems I had, and sexually speaking, were always driven to the devil argument from my sister. That I was being manipulated by Satan to wake up with erections every morning. That I was being controlled by Satan to masturbate, to steal pornography, all under the consensus, oblivious consensus that nothing had happened to me before to conform my mind into the mindset that I was abused, and now my mind is tied in knots from common sense and basic humanity because of the way I was used for someone else's sexual needs because of my age. My cousin knew what he was doing. He knew that I viewed our relationship as a friendship. And so he knew, because I was young, I was easy to prey on, and that I wouldn't question anything because I didn't know what was going on. He knew this. It's the same privilege. He used the same privilege he has with as the Catholic Church uses on their child victims, their children, and they have the privilege of having a white collar and the title of Reverend next to their name. I think the whole Catholic Church sex scandal is what was causing my downfall from religion in the first place. If I had to guess anyways. But there was still so much influence on my brain from a religious standpoint. People do not understand the kind of mentality that religion really enforces on people. The wish to be a slave, the fact that you're never good enough and you're never going to be good enough. The fact that there is so many ways you can do so much wrong, but there's only one way to be a good person. It's insanity. It's poisonous. And I bring that up because, like I said, it had a detrimental effect on my mental well-being, because I was scared of hell a lot as a child, because my sister always made me feel like I was a spawn from hell. My mother's basic solution to everything was church. Even when I last attempted suicide, the first thing that came into my mother's mind was, I need to go to church. She tried to drag me to church when I couldn't walk after an overdose. The last overdose, I went pretty heavy on because I really wanted to succeed. I took all the antidepressant pills that I could find. I didn't take them every pill in the bottle, but I took a pretty considerate amount of each one. And on top of that, I added my mother's heart medication. I figured if the antidepressants weren't enough, I would think a pill that basically skyrockets my heart rate would also do the trick. It nearly did. I passed out. Even I don't remember passing out, but I did at some point, and I woke up. My room was in the basement at the time, so I woke up in my room in the basement, and I realized I was numb all over, and I couldn't move. I couldn't walk. My head was insanely heavy. It's my cat here. I couldn't even speak to shout for help. I was just paralyzed, for lack of a better term. Despite all of this, my mother's response was I was going to church whether I liked it or not that day. It wasn't to call an ambulance or anything. It was church. When she finally realized that that I couldn't walk, for one. When she finally realized I wasn't able to get up, she left me. She went to church herself, she left me. And I suffered. She was probably gone for maybe 2 or 3 hours, but it felt like an eternity to me, with all the numbness and being paralyzed and whatnot that I was going through in the aftermath of the overdose. But she came back and she came downstairs and she said she was kicking me out. She was sending me to live with my father because she said she didn't want me to be dead in her house. She'd rather me die in his house. And since that day, up until almost 10 years ago, that's where I lived, was with my father. That was the last time I attempted to commit suicide, though, because I came to a lot of realizations through that paralysis, through that numbness, through the lack of not being able to use my voice. And also, not being at my mother's house anymore. I came to some realizations. The pain and the numbness that I went through on this day, I used it to write a story, a short story, that I call the Pitchfork Requisition. It's basically entirely me describing the aftermath of my suicide attempt, but I mixed some hallucinations along with it to make it more of a horror story. And I think after I wrote that, I wouldn't say I found meaning in my life, but I think writing that story where I was using my head was what taught me to start thinking more on my own rather than just living my life on autopilot like I had been up to that point. To this day, since then, which was March or April of 2003 was when I last attempted, to this day, I have not attempted my life since. But that does not mean I'm cured. In fact, I'm far from it. I think most people who have attempted suicide will tell you that the thought never leaves your mind. You think about it on a daily basis. It's a struggle daily to not actually go through with it. It's an act of courage to go through every day without going through with it, because you know the option is there. The misery you're experiencing and whatnot, you know there's a way out. And being able to abstain yourself from making that a reality for yourself, I mean, that does take courage, whether people want to interpret it that way or not. For your own personal security, it takes courage to not do it. And it's a daily struggle for anyone who has actually attempted to take their lives by their own hand. I think about it every day. The thought, there's never an hour in any day that I don't think about it. That's my mental disorder. I've also made a vow to never take any antidepressants ever again. I've made it a vow of myself to also never to seek therapy anymore. The last time I went to a therapist was for my ex-wife, because she wanted us to seek marriage counseling, and the entire time it was basically just her emasculating me in front of the therapist, and the therapist never let me speak. It was just about antagonizing me the entire time, and I told her I'm not going. There's no logical person would think that's going to help a marriage where it's completely asymmetrical who gets to vent, and it's completely asymmetrical who gets to be antagonized all the time. So I know I said I would avoid jump cuts, but I had to do it at that section for my daughter. I had to do it. I don't want the rest of the world to know about her mother before she knows. That's not right. So there's an edit there for that reason. That's just everything I said. However long this video is just a tiny fraction, a small testimony to why mental health is a serious issue with me. It's a tiny fraction of why I take sexual abuse victims being oppressed by people who don't even know them very seriously. You don't need to take sides when someone makes sexual abuse allegations. You need to do one thing. All you got to do is say if this person was abused or not. If this person was abused, then they have the right to get justice. That's all. You don't have to say that they're telling the truth. You don't have to say that they're telling a lie. In fact, it's not even your place to do so. When Michael Jackson's estate put those concert footages up the same day the Leaving Neverland botchumentary, I like to call it, because it was a botch to say the least. But the fact that his estate put those concert footages up on YouTube the same day that documentary was going to first air, that it was going to premiere, that was the most anti-victim thing they could have done in that situation. All they had to do, they could have just said that whatever they say we think it isn't true. But if it is true, they have a right to say their piece. Especially considering in most sexual abuse cases, the side with the most money is always the one that wins. In this case, it's obviously the MJ estate when it comes to that. So, in that regard, if I was in those men's places and the only sort of accountability or some form of compensation I could get from being abused was that documentary, yes, I would have done the same thing. I would have done it. Because the chances of getting justice in the courts are slim on things like that. But his estate putting that footage up the same time that premiered, that pissed me off, to say the least, to see them do that. That's the most anti-victim thing you can do. Even if they aren't actually victims, it affects how people perceive other actual victims. So I hope Michael's estate is proud of them for doing that. Proud of themselves for doing that. So, anyways, I've rambled long enough. As I said, this is just a tiny fraction of my stance on the issue of mental health and why it's so important to me. I may go into further detail about other instances of how it still affects me to this day, but yeah, I think what I said is good enough for now, and it's long enough, so I appreciate you for listening. for letting me vent. And I hope my next dance video, if it's a live video that is, would be the remake of Smooth Criminal. I have to set my studio up first. I'm still in the process of finding a house, but that isn't going very well right now, so we'll just have to see. But I'm hoping Smooth Criminal will be my next video, so keep an eye out on my community tab on my YouTube page. If you don't, please watch my Fade to Black video if you haven't already, and I'll see you later. Thank you.